not in an official assessment context, but at least continue to give her students feedback on their work, which I think is really, really exciting. We have a few more people registered, but I think we'll go ahead and get started with our conversation today. And just so you all know, this is all being recorded, and we will happily share the recording out with you after. So if you miss something, you can go back and look at the recording. I'm going to encourage you all, because there's enough of us that it would be challenging to manage, everybody posting at the same time, to use the chat feature. If you have a question, I'll be monitoring the chat, so you can feel free to put a question that you have for any of us in the chat. I know Kevin Kelly is also here, and he's our conference director this year, so he's on the back end, and now he's just going to be a real show off, and I think that maybe is Gaelic that he's put in the
well done, Kevin. Beautiful.
Right, he's such a show off. Participation points go to Kevin for all of that. But yes, please use the chat to if you have a detailed question that you'd like to ask. We can also use the participants feature. I've got that up on my screen, and so you may know from, maybe we all know too much about Zoom these days, but there is a feature where you could raise your hand or react, and then there's the reaction buttons at the bottom of the screen too. So if you hear something you really like, you can add a thumbs up or clap your hands. So we'll do our best to use those tools. But again, please feel free to just chat with us. And if you really have a burning question and you'd like to just actually speak, which will be great to hear your voice as well, feel free to unmute and just and interrupt and ask a question. So I think without further ado, I'm really pleased to introduce Lisa Donaldson, who's a learning technologist in the Teaching Enhancement Unit at Dublin City University, and also our newest AAEEBL board member. So we're really pleased to welcome Lisa to the AAEEBL community, although she's already been in the community for a while. So glad to have you with us. And then also really pleased to have Naoimh O'Reilly, who is an assistant professor in the business school at Dublin City University, and both have been working with portfolios and thinking about assessment in particular, and so are going to share some of their thoughts about ways that we can do this well. So maybe I can turn this over to you, Lisa. If there's one thing that you think we need to do as teachers to do assessment with portfolios well, or do it right, or even do the right thing, what would that look like?
Well, I think support is the big thing for any lecturer thinking about adopting ePortfolio. What we found is that a lot of our faculty have been somewhat reluctant to embrace all of the many benefits that ePortfolio can bring, because they're not necessarily aware of what's involved, concerns about the technology and the platforms itself, concerns around how to pedagogically embed ePortfolio into a program. And what in our instance in DCU, we were very lucky in that our president himself wrote ePortfolio into our strategic plan. So this 5-year plan, what he wanted at the end of it was that every student in DCU would walk away with an ePortfolio, specifically around showcasing their graduate attributes. So to make that happen, they actually kind of created a position for me. And I was brand new, I knew nothing about ePortfolios really, but it was my role then to support mainly the lecturers, but also the students themselves. So I think it's a little bit of a mistrust, a fear, and if you can break down that fear, I think anybody that I have worked with over the last 3 years that has used ePortfolio has come back to say, wow, that worked really well. And Naoimh is one of those. Naoimh, we started with a very small pilot group in DCU, and I suppose that would be another thing, start small, embed ePortfolio. You can do low stakes, you can do small pilots. But we started with a small pilot program of 10 lecturers in our first year, which grew into 5,500 students using the ePortfolio in the first year. And within 3 years, we were up to 15,000 users on our ePortfolio platform. To say it grew exponentially, it was quite an amazing thing to see. Now, we're still not there yet. It's still not an institutional, no, it's in the strategic plan. It's still not an institutional approach, and very much a modular basis, but we're getting there. So I suppose I'll hand over to Naoimh. What do you think was, I suppose, most beneficial to getting you started, your students started?
Well, getting the students started was because they had to. Let's be honest. In terms of, I think for me, getting started, it was to find a different way to try and capture what students were learning. And if you remember, our first pilot was with our students who were studying abroad. And so one of the things we were trying to do was create a connection back into us. And then really importantly, to make explicit to them the journey that they'd gone through their time abroad. And I think the huge richness that we saw really early on was as students started to look back, even 3 or 4 months in, at those original reflections that they had posted, seeing them track their journey. And I'm kind of struck with that, as we were talking earlier about music students, John, that idea of actually where I started from and where I am now. I don't know a better way to show students that, or to allow them to experience it. So I think, and you know, I'm very conscious that the first time you use ePortfolios, it may not go smoothly or as smoothly as you'd planned. But when you're finished and you look and you see what's happened for the students through the journey, it's such a rich thing. And I think, you know, Lisa, champions have been hugely important in terms of spreading it. But actually, once you use it, you become a champion for it, because you see the power of this and what it does for students. And that making explicit that learning process and that journey, for me, has been one of the most important elements. And we've had lovely feedback around that. You know, students talking about just having a time and a space to reflect, acknowledging that they documented that learning experience in a way that they didn't realize, and sort of being able to pick out, when they look back, things that they might have said or done and how they would reflect on that later. So it made a very eventful year a reflective year as well. And I think that for me was the huge advantage of that early use of it in an unusual setting, I suppose.
And you saw, Naoimh, the growth in the digital skills over that period as well, didn't you?
Oh. Absolutely. And I suppose, you know, we moved on from using it with the students who were away to using it in more traditional modules. And so I would use it now in my digital marketing module. And for me, one of the real advantages now for those students is that they have a huge experience of a content management system. So up until now, all of their experience really has been around, you know, Microsoft or Google designed systems, which are very much cut and paste and WYSIWYG, whereas suddenly they're having to think a little bit more about placement and design and layout. And so there's another learning that happens behind that. And particularly for marketing students, that's something of huge value. But I think as well, just, you know, in terms of even moving outside of all of those things, having to think about how you present evidence, how you substantiate claims, just how you lay a page out, has a huge benefit for students. So it's really seeing, when you say to students, you know, this is about theory and practice. Can you support the theory that you're suggesting here with cases? Can you show me how this applies? Actually having to think about how you do that, because I think some colleagues are quite skeptical about sort of the intellectual rigor of ePortfolios. Yes, it's fine for the experiential stuff, but where's the intellectual rigor? But actually, when you see a really well done ePortfolio to answer a traditional exam question, which, you know, is one of the things that we pivoted and used them for in the business school in the last wee while, has just been so rich and well beyond the kind of learning that you would demonstrate, I think, in, you know, 5 questions, answer 3 in a 2-hour exam kind of approach. So there's a real richness to it, I think, that goes way beyond the kind of standard assessment learning, for me anyway.
It seems to me that, you know, as you were both speaking, you know, first the point about keep it simple and start small is so important, especially in this context when we're trying new things and maybe don't want to do everything all at once. But you were also speaking about, you know, the richness of the evidence and the need to substantiate claims. So how are you scaffolding that for students? Because one of the things that I often hear from colleagues is that they got these beautiful, rich portfolios, but when they went back to look at the outcomes, it was difficult to see where the evidence actually enabled the students to document that they were meeting the outcomes. And so how have you thought about that at all? How have you mediated that in your context?
So I suppose some of this is the opposite to what Lisa would recommend. So for me, it has been very much an iterative learning experience. And I think for the first group, it was very much, oh, can you prove it? Or can you show me evidence? And the students came up with very creative ways of demonstrating learning, way beyond things that I would have thought about suggesting to them. And so then in subsequent years, you can say, here are examples of how people have done this previously. You might find a different way, and that's fantastic, but this might start you to think about it. So for example, you know, one of the things that we ask the students who are studying abroad to do is to demonstrate that they've engaged in an international environment, so that they can show that they've kind of fitted in and belonged and participated in teams of international student members. And one of the kind of very simple ways that they did that was a screenshot of a WhatsApp chat organizing to do a project. And it wouldn't have occurred to me to suggest that to them, but you can really see, you can see affection, you can see the kind of casual use of language, you can see them congratulating each other after, you know, the presentation that had gone so well. So you see all of those things in a very simple piece of documentation, and students are good at that. I think once you suggest to them ways of doing that, they find even better ways.
Yeah, I suppose from my perspective, I have very much a helicopter view of that because I'm not teaching an actual module or subject. What I do is I sit with those who are teaching the modules and subjects and have that discussion about how are they going to evidence the learning outcomes that they're trying to assess with the ePortfolio. And that's very much a one-on-one discussion. And it revolves around a lot around exactly that question. Well, how can they show you that? So what we most typically do, and this came back to actually your sister organization, the CRA, when I first got involved and went to my very first ePortfolio conference, and I knew very little in the space at the time. But the overriding message that I came away with was you need to scaffold and support the students in developing their ePortfolio. So providing them with a template, providing them with the exemplars, that's what I really took away. So for novice users of ePortfolio, we really, I'm not saying dumb it down, but we do make it simple for them to engage with the technology so that the technology is invisible, so that they can just deal with what they're actually learning and what they're trying to demonstrate. So we do, again, in those conversations, we look at most generally creating a very basic template. The portfolio that we use, Mahara, we actually invested in some developments to support greater flexibility in the types of medium that could be used, that the students could generate to demonstrate their learning. So it's a lot more flexible a tool now. So really we kind of give the students the bigger picture, referring back to the learning outcomes, and then the lecturer hands it over. But that's very much a kind of an individual process, lecturer by lecturer, faculty by faculty. But based on all of that, and based on all these conversations, and based on 3 years worth of questions that I've gotten from faculty and questions that I've gotten from students, I suppose there are some golden rules that we have developed around that. And also based on your book, Documenting Learning, as well, because that was pivotal in looking at areas that the lecturers needed to things the lecturers needed to put in place to support their students. So again, the exemplars, the early introduction to the activity as well as to the platform, and feedback and support throughout. So there's a lot of little things that we've kind of tied together now, and on an annual basis, we kind of roll out. Now it'll be online, but we do roll out those supports to our faculty to enable them to work with the students.
Thank you so much. So rubrics, I know you have developed a rubric. Shall I show it? Is this a good time to,
yeah, absolutely,
to sort of stick it up there? And, you know, one of the things that we often speak about in terms of portfolio learning and assessment is the importance of using rubrics. So maybe you could share just a little bit about what you're doing with this particular rubric. I love that it's the holy grail of rubrics.
That's very tongue. I know that's cheeky. Where that came from was exactly from those golden rules. So you need to make explicit expectations. And you need to make explicit how they are going to evidence the learning outcomes. So having looked online, I found there's many portfolio rubrics that are available, and I popped them all on for the faculties to use with their students as a support. What I found, some were excellent in one area, some were weaker in one area. So what I did as part of ePortfolio Ireland, our community of practice, is I had a thought that in one of our sessions that we'd get the smartest people that I knew in the ePortfolio space in one room, and we'd take some of the main headings from these many ePortfolio rubrics and see if we would use them and or come up with some of our own, and then address the different levels within those. So I think Naoimh was in the room. Were you in the room where it happened? No, you were in a different room. So we're all about
nope.
The moment.
Well, my house too.
So Naoimh wasn't in the room where it happened, but there was about 12 or 15 people in that room. And between us, we put our heads together to try and pick the most impactful criteria for across many disciplines, many levels. And I cheekily called it the Holy Grail of rubrics, and it's kind of stuck because I haven't come up with anything better. Once it was completed, which we did after the account, that's shared and up on our ePortfolio community of practice website for anybody to use. And one of our lecturers actually was presenting internally about, he's a first-time user of ePortfolio and was presenting to a DCU audience 2 weeks ago. He used the rubric and said it was critical to the success of the ePortfolio assessment for him and for his students, because it gave them a roadmap. It showed them where and how they could achieve what they were setting out to achieve. So, I mean, I think it fully supports the student endeavors here. There may be better ones, but this is just, I suppose, a collaborative attempt to consolidate lots of different rubrics.
So would you say that this particular rubric in the context of DCU is aligned with your kind of strategic plan and the sort of from the top down suggestion that this is a really important practice for faculty to engage in and encouraging people to use it? I guess the question I have is, are these, sort of categories the ones that were the things that came up across the disciplines all the time? Are they specific to your campus? Do faculty members adapt them at all for their own disciplinary contexts?
A good question, and I'd love to say that there was enough joined up thinking that this came from the strategic plan. I'd love to say that, but I won't be saying that. No, this basically came from a group of people actually across the country. So it's not DCU specific at all. There was a number of people from DCU in the room, but probably only 3 or 4, and the rest were spread out across universities and institutes of higher education across the country. So it's definitely not institution specific. Oh yeah, that's in the collaboratory, I think. It's not institution specific, so I think it's probably usable across all of the disciplines, across many different, as I say, different levels, different institutions, because they're the people that actually pulled it together.
Great. I want to just maybe ask Terry if he has any comments to make about rubrics and portfolios, just given the long-standing work of the Value Institute.
Sure, thank you. Well, much like Lisa was describing, we have found with our rubrics that they are designed to be more generally available and useful. And so that does allow for the kinds of conversations and the exchanges that, as a community of practice, I think are so important, is to have something that is shared. Yeah. And also something that is not the creation of a single person or a single institution, but indeed reflects input and contributions from a multitude of folks in a multitude of settings as well as lenses that are brought to the learning that is being evaluated by the rubric or represented through the rubric. No matter what rubric one uses, I think it's a useful thing, and I think it strengthens the rubric because it does indeed move it from something that's in my head. And I recall as being a faculty member, you know, I always had some kind of structure or frame that I was using for evaluating anything that I was asking students to do, but it often was not explicit. And it wasn't even explicit to me in terms of recognizing that I wasn't being explicit. And so this is really a process that helps us learn as well. But again, learning is not something that is done in isolation. Learning is a social phenomenon, and it is an iterative phenomenon. And so we begin to model and to engage in our assessment of it that is much more reflective of the process that actually is occurring, and that we engage with our students in learning what the learning looks like. And so it's not to be real obtuse in that kind of thing, but it is what's actually transpiring and happening over time. And so rubrics are also meant to be modified. And so they are a starting point for people to use. And so we always encourage our folks to modify them. But the farther you move away in terms of modifications, the less shared conversation you can have in terms of the robustness of that. But some variation, some modification is usually powerful and useful for the students and the individuals using it in a particular context. And so it is always that kind of balancing act. The thing that I see in this, and thank you so much for doing this and sharing it, is something that we struggled with as well, and we continue to struggle with, is that each one of these criteria and each one of the performance levels that are laid out are multifaceted. They've got multiple things that are looked for in each one of those criteria and in each one of those boxes. And so if you're entering into an assessment of what is happening, I know at least in the US context, we're often trying to reduce it to a particular grade or number or score. It makes it really difficult to, well, two of the three things are there, or there's only one of it. So what do we do with that? And so again, it's the kind of thing that does lend itself to a recognition of the breadth of learning and the intricacy of learning, but it also allows it to be something that is reflective of a more localized context. And so the folks that are using it locally can engage in that conversation and set out some ground rules for how to approach it in our context that works for us. But we struggle with it all the time, and we constantly have folks using our rubrics to say, well, can't we just break those things out? And we've said, well, when the folks were providing it, they were developing it, they actually expected all three of those things to be there. And if they aren't there, then it doesn't achieve acceptable if all three of the things aren't there at that level. And so, but it all highlights the judgment part that still has to be made. But it's reinforced and expanded and exemplified, I think, in what is shared in terms of the kinds of things, the kinds of learning, the categories of things that do need to be there. And I think from what we found from asking students about their experience with it, using a rubric, is that it also deepens their learning, because they do understand that learning is a complex set of things that are constantly evolving and hopefully growing as we scaffold that learning, and they get to see how it is scaffolded. The other piece of this I'll just comment on and then I'll be quiet is we also always struggle with the rubrics and the utilization of them to try to have the language and the descriptors be positive, i.e. looking for what is there that the student can do, that she or he can do, rather than what is missing and what's not there. That can come out in the conversation about it, but one of the useful things of a rubric that focuses on what students are and can do it at whatever the level is, it gives them something to build on. It gives them something that they can point to, that they can do it. It's a recognition of their abilities. And it is, as Kevin is suggesting, the language in the chat, to build from. And that says we can get better, and this is how we get better. And so if it's all about what's not there, you have nothing to build on, and you don't have any incentive to build. And so that's always something that we also try to pay attention to. It's never perfect. It can always be improved, and we just accept that and move on. But we find that it does help our students, and they really appreciate that they're being acknowledged for doing something. Every one of our students can do something. Okay, and that's the hook. That's the thing that we want to focus on and build off of. Even though they may not be ever exemplary at with their position or their point in their careers and their development, but they still have value. They still have things they do, and we need to acknowledge that and help them see how to build on that. So I love this. I love the complexity and the multifaceted nature of it, and the process you use to put it together. I think all of those things are just great.
And I think thank you for that, Terry. I think there's probably a lot of different versions of this already within DCU, because it is embedded in our learning management system. It is editable by the faculty to contextualize it to their own discipline and to add what they need to and take away what they don't. So I think that flexibility is important, absolutely, with the rubric.
And I think, just to echo your point around how students learn and how a rubric can drive student learning, the fact that it's made available to students in advance, the fact that for lots of us, ePortfolio submission is iterative. They're doing, a piece, getting feedback, the next piece, getting feedback, that the students themselves start to maybe develop their writing around the rubric a lot more as time goes on. So I think in early stages, you get a lot more not achieved or not yet achieved. But as you move on, you start to see students move up, particularly around, the very basic, easy to control things that in the first time around, they're concentrating a lot on the tool. They don't necessarily think so much about the content or referencing or issues like that. Over time, the rubric helps them to focus back in on all of the pieces that they have to achieve, I think.
And I mean, and to me, that also points to the importance of feedback, you know, that we can't expect to present them with this rubric at the beginning of the semester, throw them off, leave them to their own devices, and hope that they're going to turn something in that is reflective of what we're hoping they'll present as evidence, but rather to get that feedback and to, you know, to think, I've been encouraging my colleagues to think through carefully where they can give feedback to the students, not necessarily in a really formal way, but building into the learning activities opportunities to give feedback about the evidence that the students are generating. So they you know, they feel like they're on the right track and they have that opportunity to grow and learn over the either the span of the course or if it's at a program level across a program.
And speaking of feedback, another one of our pilot colleagues in the first year of ePortfolio, yes, I have just posted the link to the rubric into the collaboratory, so that is available, and I can actually pop it into the chat as well. One of our colleagues had a large class, around about 100 students, and required them to do 6 ePortfolio activities over the course of the program, and gave feedback on every one. So 600 pieces of feedback within 12 weeks. So she worked hard. She worked incredibly hard to give that kind of support for the students. But what they also did was that they, and again, while she didn't use a rubric, she did give guidelines. They were asked to review each other's ePortfolio. So peer review was part of it as well. So what those students found was at the end of the 12 weeks, they had gained so much from their peer feedback, their lecturer feedback. The failure rate of a typically hard module, as she would describe it herself, dropped from 15% down to 3%. The average grade soared. But that's as a result of a huge amount of hard work. But it's seeing not only your own learning but other students' learning and how they're tackling different topics and what their understanding is, the different outside resources that the students brought into their ePortfolio. So the students then got, I suppose, exposure to a whole range of elements that they wouldn't have thought of or come across themselves. So it was incredibly successful. So, I mean, if you're talking about feedback, the peer feedback can be extremely powerful as well with ePortfolio. But again, some kind of guidelines around good feedback is important.
Yeah, it's like anything else, you know, learn your digital literacy skills. Well, we need to help them to do that, you know, learn to give feedback. We need to, and I think we've probably all had the experience as students ourselves where we were thrown into a group project with no guidance or, you know, suggestion about how we each should perform our roles or that there should even be different roles within a group and those sorts of things. So stepping back and thinking about, you know, assessment at this more holistic level and then figuring out in a backward design kind of approach, you know, what evidence do I want to see and then what activities can I engage them in that will enable them to really generate that evidence of learning so that it's clear in their portfolio for me as the person ultimately who has to score it, give them a grade, whatever it looks like. So really important things for sure. I want to just make sure that we give the participants an opportunity to ask questions, and I did receive a couple of questions in advance. Someone asked whether there are examples of portfolios being used for assessment of language learning. So I'm not sure if anyone on the call is in language learning, but I can say that yes, there definitely are some examples of people using, and I woke up to this question this morning, so I haven't had a chance to search those out, but we will definitely pay attention to that. Lisa?
Yeah, I can speak to that, but not personally. The Community of Practice generated an ebook, which I know you have there, Tracy, and part of that was pulling together case studies of ePortfolio based assessment in different contexts, different institutions, different disciplines, because in my role, I was trying to show examples of the benefits of ePortfolio and how good ePortfolio assessment might be designed. So I reached out to others in the field. And one of those that I reached out to is Teresa McKinnon from Warwick University. And her case study on language learning is actually in that ebook. So she would absolutely be a good reference.
So let me just see if I can, for whatever reason, I'm not opening it. Can you see it on my screen?
Yeah, can
Mhm.
you see it? You should be able to just click on the little arrow. And
That's what I thought. I did it before. Just be, oh, because it's maybe not showing the arrow.
there you go.
There we go.
So on the left-hand side, well, yeah, keep going. Just flick through. You'll find it.
You see, all of your heads are in the way. That's the challenge.
I know. Good way. And now who's drawing?
Yeah. Oh, well, someone's drawing. Yeah. Fun.
There you go. There's Teresa's case study on language learning.
Awesome. So.
And she's been using ePortfolio for language learning for a long time now. She'd be a huge advocate for it.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. And so we can definitely connect. And just so you all know, we will post these resources. We're creating a gallery for the week. And so you'll be able to see the various resources. You know, you'll have a link to the various conversations that happen through the week. And we encourage you in the collaboratory to share examples of colleagues or your own work that you're doing with portfolio and assessment, so that we can be sure to include that. And thank you, Elise, for sharing the example from Puget Sound. So that's fantastic. We'll make sure that gets into the gallery. The other question that came from this, and again, maybe it is in the book as well, Lisa, could samples of work from a student portfolio be used as a stimulus for discussion in an oral assessment of first language or second language learning? And are there any international examples of this happening? So, I mean, my instinct would be to say yes. I'm sure there are examples, and for sure, I think those, you know, the samples could be used as a prompt or as a way to kind of get the examples there to go into the portfolio and use them as a way to stimulate student response and those sorts of things. But yeah. Other questions that folks have that maybe have popped up, and certainly feel free, I don't know, Elise, if you want to speak a little bit about the Japanese teacher who is using the great examples in the portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, I would be happy to share if anyone would be interested in hearing a little bit about what they have done. The faculty member that I worked with really noticed in Japanese 101 that students were learning so much content in that first year that they felt very overwhelmed by their language acquisition and never really felt like they got a good understanding or felt like they were very competent in what they were learning, that they kept just moving on to the next content and the next content, and never really felt that they'd acquired the proficiency that they hoped that they would, at least that wasn't as visible to students. So if you look at the link that I shared, that collection was built over the course of actually 2 semesters in Japanese, and they in each unit had to write a little paragraph in Japanese using the language conventions that they'd been learning about, and then they had to record their voice speaking that content, and the professor would go in for each unit and correct the grammar and give some feedback. And her goal was for them to, over the course of the semester, and then again over the course of the year, to have built sort of you'll see in the template, they went from little drafts to a full about me page in Japanese. And then in the next semester, they did information about, you know, their past and about their friends. And then they kind of wrote a final assignment around, you know, who am I, who are my friends, where am I going, my goals. So they essentially created a little bit of a showcase ePortfolio in Japanese. But she said she was really amazed by what the students noticed over time, because she had them actually, she swapped out her final assessment, her final test, and also her one-on-one interviews with students sharing out stuff from their ePortfolios, and actually using that in lieu of a test, where some students who had typically done very poorly on the test, as was mentioned earlier, used the rubric for the ePortfolio to be much more successful in the ePortfolio assignment and still showcase the language proficiencies that she was hoping to see. So it was a really cool shift for her in that assignment. So
Do you know, Elise, whether she, was that like a big undertaking for her, or did she do it incrementally? How did it work? Do you know?
You know, she and I met the summer, like last summer, and we talked through her learning outcomes and we talked through the structure that would make sense for her course. As was mentioned, the technology can be daunting. So I helped build the template tailored to what she wanted it structured like. And then we went and did the technical support with her. And so then they just did little slices over the course of the semester. So she and the students both gained sort of ePortfolio proficiency over time. And they sort of saw that that development felt very easy over time because it was just little slices rather than one big ePortfolio assignment, you know, at the end, which would have been much more daunting and I think not as been as successful. So.
Yeah, and I love that. And if it's helpful for folks, one of the things that that I've been doing with some of my colleagues is really encouraging them to think, you know, and sort of start small with how they actually do this work. And it sounds like she did exactly that. Mm-hmm. You know, sort of thinking through, you know, this whole backward design process, which probably many of us are familiar with. You know, really getting them to think about, you know, the evidence that's going to be acceptable. So again, what does exemplary look like? What does acceptable look like? And then really having them kind of think through, even starting small, like what's one essential learning outcome that you want your students to address in your particular context, and then thinking about what evidence of that outcome you would need to see, and then what activity or activities would generate that evidence. And, you know, when I sort of showed this slide and we talked about, you know, in this case, it was a nursing example. And, you know, if the end goal was to be able to analyze a patient history, you know, and write about that. So that was their evidence, you know, this is my reflection about what I saw and how I analyzed the case. You know, what kinds of activities would we need to engage the students in to enable them to build those skills? And, you know, it was really interesting, the conversation, and I was having it with a whole department. So that made a really, I think, significant difference. You know, if you're on your own, you can definitely do this as well, but it was really powerful that they were doing it as a whole group. And, you know, they just started to say, okay, well, we have some rubrics, how could we adapt them? And then, okay, if you do this in your class and you do that in your class, and then if we, you know, because they were all speaking about the need for the students to develop professionalism skills. And so it also took it to that other level of a more, you know, holistic or global level for the learning in the whole program. And it was really exciting to just, when we reframed it around what evidence do you need to see, you know, the way they were thinking about how they were going to, you know, engage the students in the activities and how they would document and show that evidence of learning that did go beyond, you know, I could answer, you know, as Naoimh said earlier, you know, 3 out of 5 questions on the exam in 2 hours, you know, to something that seems much more powerful. So, you know, I love that idea that they kind of got there and they just needed just that little bit of scaffolding to kind of get them thinking about it. Because of course, none of us are trained to think about how we just teach. Other comments or questions that you all have? I know there's lots of experts in the room. Kevin, maybe I can pick on you for a minute. One of the things that I think is such an important part of the conversation that we should make sure that we consider when we're thinking about assessment and portfolios are the ideas of equity and access. And I know that's one of your areas of expertise. And I wondered if you had any thoughts specifically about the whole idea of how do we do the right thing or do it well with equity and access in mind, given that our students are mostly going to be working in probably unfamiliar contexts in the fall.
You bet. And I'll just make a slight correction. Instead of expertise, I'm going to put areas of exploration because I'm still learning myself. But I have been lucky to work with a group in Oakland, California, the Peralta Community College District, and we created a rubric called the Peralta Equity Rubric that helps instructors look not just at assessment assignments, but also their entire course. And so it can inform the assessment aspects of a course when we think about things like access. And at least in the States right now, we're seeing around 20 to 25% of students don't have adequate access to the internet. We also see in the stay-at-home paradigm that students in college are sometimes in a house with 1 or 2 devices. And so they're sharing with working adults, with other students in college, with other students in the primary and elementary and secondary school. And so they may not have access to the computer at the time they need it. We're also finding that almost a quarter of students don't have access to a quiet study space. So creating an ePortfolio artifact takes time, takes attention, and the constant state of interruption. The psychologist will tell you you're starting over every time you re-begin the task. And so it's almost like satellites trying to stay in orbit. They're constantly battling between being thrown off into space or hurtling in toward the Earth, and they have so many micro adjustments. I would be tired before getting around the Earth just once. So there's the access issue, and some things that I have brought up in different presentations as strategies can be just to provide alternative formats for students to submit their work. And this semester, I'm playing with the idea of getting a Google Voice account so that students, if they're not able to type an essay because they only have a mobile device and they don't want to type a full essay with their thumbs, could basically write it out with pen and paper and then read it into a voicemail message on Google Voice. And I could use the same rubric to analyze whether or not they've made transitions, whether they've supported their argument with sources. And so we have to start thinking about how do we, in a universal design for learning sense and many others, how do we provide multiple pathways for students to show what they know? Another aspect of equity, most people do focus on things like access to technology and even accessibility for students with disabilities. And so obviously we want to consider that. But then we have many first generation students, those who are in the first generation in their family to go to college. And so there are sometimes what we call hidden curriculum, where we make assumptions about what students know about completing an assignment. And so I have gone through every one of my activities in my course and used the transparent assignment template from what's called the Transparency in Learning and Teaching Project out of University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And that the core difference between what I had been doing and what I'm doing now is I inserted a rationale. Why are we doing this? And making direct connections, not only to the learning outcomes, but to practical skills that they may use in the workforce. And so putting that in, I wasn't quite sure how it would play out with students, but I did it over a summer, just basically right about now, but 3 or 4 years ago. And I had a student who had failed my class in the spring, and only because he hadn't been able to keep up with the work. But when he retook it that fall, he actually sent me an email at the end of the semester saying, whatever you did to change the instructions for your activities this time around, I knew what I had to do. And so that was exciting to hear, even though it was only one data point. I guess I'll just close to quote Terry, it's you don't have to listen to me drone on. But another aspect of equity is to make it possible for students to draw connections to the content from their identities, backgrounds, and cultures. And so making it an actual part of an activity for students to see the personal meaning in the work that they're doing rather than something that may seem abstract. And so an example would be at San Francisco State University, where I teach, they have this program called the Metro Academies. And there are 9 different academies now, but it started with just health education and early childhood education. And those cohorts have gone through even what we call general education courses, which are before you get to the major. They infused context into those courses like algebra or English. And so if you were in a healthcare discipline and you were on track to, this is my goal, is to be a nurse or whatever, all of the math problems would be something that you might see in a hospital setting. All the English assignments would be something about writing a letter to an insurance agency related to health or whatever. And so they made it so that these activities had more meaning. And so in an equity sense, I would encourage everybody to think about how can we help students or ask students to make connections between their lives and what they're studying and what they're turning in.
Thanks, Kevin. I can see Naoimh, you nodding vigorously throughout as Kevin was speaking. It sounds like it looks like you're doing this in business as well.
I think, it's been a huge learning curve for all of us these last few months. And one thing that really struck me from what Kevin has said is just, we'd all thought about a digital gap. We'd all thought about the fact that students may not have broadband or access to devices, those kind of things. It had actually never occurred to me that physical space would be one of the biggest constraints that my students would face. So that was a real learning for me, just thinking about, students who were literally working through the night, because that was when the kitchen table was free and the device was free and the broadband wasn't particularly heavily used. So I just think that idea of physical space in a very real way is an issue that students will face that we just really haven't thought about at all. And those of us who are kind of privileged enough to lock ourselves in offices, although if you could hear the sound surrounding me at the moment, you wouldn't think I was all that privileged. It's something that we really need to think about. So, things like asynchronicity, things like flexibility around submission, and as you say, Kevin, flexibility in terms of format of submission just become more and more important, I think, this year than they've ever been before.
Yeah, and it seems to me that, at the end of the day, that, what we're speaking about is the basic premise of folio thinking. How do we engage the learner to be reflective, to make connections between who they are and what they're learning? But the more intentional we can be about that, I think the better off our students will be. And, it will enable them to hopefully be successful, even though they do, many of them, I'm sure, will have many different kinds of constraints that, as you said, we may not even imagine them having. Yeah. Anyone else have any burning questions or things that they would like to ask before we round up our session?
I guess I'd just add, building on what Naoimh said, the current situation with coronavirus and all is amplifying existing equity challenges. And so even when we're past this time, and hopefully it's soon, but we still need to consider these issues and come up with real solutions. When I hear about students who are working in their cars and sometimes driving to parking lots on campus, and they know the spots where they're closest to the Wi-Fi connectivity, then that's a sign that we've still got work to do.
Lisa, did you want to add anything?
No, I wholeheartedly agree with both Naoimh and Kevin there, and I suppose it comes back to this overarching pedagogy of care, which I think is going to be more important than anything else that we do around content or anything else over the coming term. It's taking these things into consideration. It's looking at the picture of the student as a whole and what they are going through and how we can best support and make what can often be what will be a distanced learning experience feel more like a community experience for the student.
Absolutely, and really leveraging the social nature of these pedagogical approaches so that, I think we're clearly all in this together in ways that none of us imagined, but I think it's true for our students too. And what's been most heartening to me is working with colleagues who are really thinking about that. In places I work at a primarily medical school, and where faculty before were, it's only the multiple choice exam, you cannot deviate from that plan, and it has to happen at midterm and final. And now we're looking at okay, what are some alternate ways that we could allow the students to demonstrate that they're understanding this material and meeting the outcomes, which is really exciting. And I think means that we're going to have lots of interesting examples and evidence that gets generated in the coming future for those of us who are doing portfolio work. So yeah, well done on all of you for being here and thinking about these issues. I did want to just mention a couple of things related to the rest of this week and the conference. Later today at noon Pacific time, we have an ePortfolio 101 session, which will really be useful for anybody who's doing portfolio work. It's meant to assist those who maybe are just getting started, but at the same time, for those of us who've been doing it for a while, you know, having these kind of conversations is always, I mean, I'm always getting new ideas and exciting insights from colleagues who are doing this work around the world. And then at 4:30 Pacific time, 4 or 4:30, Kevin? I think it's
4:30.
4:30 Pacific, we're having our first wine bar / coffee bar, depending on where you are in the world, just a social networking event where we'll be sharing some information about AAEEBL and the various member benefits and things that we're working on moving forward. Next week, we focus on digital ethics. Oh, and before we get to next week, on Friday this week, we're really excited to have Candace Reynolds and Sonia Taylor from Portland State University offering a hands-on workshop on how to create your own professional portfolio. What we learned historically is that many of us get a little bit of out of practice of creating portfolios ourselves. And it's important to model, I think, the practices we want our students to embody. And so Candace and Sonia will give us some tips on Friday at noon Pacific about how we can do that. And then next week we're on to digital ethics, and the week after stakeholders, and then the final week we'll be weaving it all together. And we know that many of you are, you know, as we've just been discussing with our students, facing similar challenges. So we've designed this to meet you where you're at. No need to be at everything if you can't, but definitely join when you can. And we will each week be creating a gallery that uses the insights that we collect from the collaboratory and also the great work that our colleagues who are sharing in the discussions have presented us with. So you can expect, starting around Thursday or Friday this week, we'll post a gallery in the page for this week and let you all know that it's there, and hopefully you will find it useful. Well, thank you so much to Lisa and Naoimh for being here, and we're so glad to learn from our colleagues in Ireland, who they keep telling us they're behind, but actually I think they're way out in front in many ways of kind of doing it right. And so thank you for all of your work, and thanks to Terry and Kevin and to all of you for questions and comments throughout this hour. We look forward to seeing you at future sessions, and in the meantime, have a great day or a great evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thanks a lot.
And there we go.
Yep.
We're good. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you.
It was really great, and yeah, I can't wait to have you more at our sessions and things. So yeah, so nice that the one bonus of being online is that we all get to be at this conference when it might be challenging for us to travel to do it. So I'm really excited.
The last time I had to make my way to Vancouver to visit you.
That's hard.
For you.
You know, and I had to make my way to Dublin to visit you. So, well, wait a minute. Maybe we do want to have that.
Yeah, no, you know, this internet thing is overrated.
Right. Well, if Naoimh and myself are still awake at 12:30, we shall join you for a drink. I think the chances of that are slim.
Slim.
Yeah, if you were still up, I would be saying, please get a Guinness, because that's what we do when we travel to Ireland and we can't sleep because of the time zones. We're like, Guinness will do it, and it always puts us to sleep. So
Okay.
Hopefully you won't have to, it won't come to that for you today.
It's now officially cocktail o'clock. It's 5 o'clock. So
well, go and enjoy it. You've both earned it. And thank you again so much. We really appreciated having you here.
Not at all. Take care.
All right.
Bye for now.
Bye.